Good morning, everybody. Having had a quick opportunity to chat with a few of this morning, I feel like I should retitle this talk From Databases to Democracy. I want to do a couple of things in a very short period of time, and I'm going to ask anyone in this room, to hold me accountable to stop talking at least 10 minutes before the hour so that we can talk together. If I say something in the next 30 minutes that you cannot prevent yourself from interrupting me, please go ahead. I mean, wave your hand and be nice about it. But I'm here to be helpful to you, and it really is a delight to be here. I also realized walking down the steps from my hotel room that I left a slide out of this deck that I think would be helpful. So on your tables, there are a couple little red round stickers. I don't know if there's enough for each of you. If they're right here. In fact, I know there's not enough for each of you. I'm now banging into things. These are the stickers for a website that we run called digitalimpact.io or digitalimpact.org, and I'll show you the address again at the end. I'm going to send you an invitation right now, and I'll reiterate it at the end of the conversation. So take one of these if it'll help you remember, although of course only 2 of them actually give you the URL on it because that's a design flaw, but what the heck. That's a website that I will lead up to why we built it and what it is. We are happy to do online tutorials about navigating that website and finding the tools that are up there. If that interests you, by the time I'm done in half an hour, let me know, and all of my contact information will be up at the end. It's a two-way street, however. When we do these, we're actually getting input from you as well about, boy, this website is a great idea, but it is a terrible design. Or I can't find X. Help me find X. Or I can't find Z. In fact, you don't even have a Z. We need a Z. Get us a Z. So we'll show you what we've got if you help us make it better. That's the way we do these webinars. That's the value exchange right there. All right, enough of that. That's what happens when you forget slides. You have to put it in the beginning. So I run something at Stanford University called the Digital Civil Society Lab. I'm very excited about what I do. I think I have one of the best jobs in the world. I am also very excited to have just been appointed to be a county commissioner for the elections in San Francisco, and I'm happy to talk about that. But let me ask you something. I run a lab called the Digital Civil Society Lab. Anybody here have any idea what digital civil society is? Oh, Peggy does. Peggy, what's your idea about what it is?
It is the interconnection between data and digital information and reaching out to voting, volunteering, donating, the expressions of civil society that characterize it.
Fantastic. You want to come run it? All right, I'm always looking. It's good to. So it is that, and I want to tell you about why those things are important. Civil society is a phrase we don't use much here in the US. We deliberately use it. It encompasses not-for-profit organizations, but it goes beyond them. And we stuck digital at the front of it, although when I convinced Stanford to let me start this thing, I said, if I'm successful, we won't need to call this out 10 years from now, this digital part. But right now, we still need to call it out. So the purpose of my conversation this morning is to help explain, from my perspective at least, and get your perspectives on this as well, why these two things matter, why it's much more than a good database or a Twitter account, both of which do matter and get us headed down this direction. And in fact, at the end of the day, or perhaps since it's only 6 o'clock my time, at the beginning of the day, it starts and ends with the democratic aspiration, the aspiration to self-govern. That's where we're going. That's why I say, yes, I can help you with your database a little bit. You could probably help me with my database. But what I'm here to talk about is democracy. So we didn't want to have this conversation. How do you like that? I did that instantly. One button and I've turned it off. This is not something that is relevant only in the US, this idea. When we first started the lab, we started putting out some papers and some ideas about why we thought this mattered, why it was much more than just whether or not you have a social media account, what we thought were the opportunities and challenges for democracy in an age of digital dependence. But we wanted to make sure we weren't just looking at this from our very beautiful campus in Northern California, or even just from the perspective of the US, so we went around the world. And so what I'm sharing with you today is a conversation that is constantly changing, it's constantly improving, and I'm trying to bring to you some of the perspectives I've learned from people around the world. Here's a little bit of Poli-Sci 101 for those of you who've happily been off the college campus for a while. There are a lot of theories of democracy. Many of them. We can do a long course on them or not. We're going to do a very basic idea that democracies are not just about voting. They're not just about elections. In fact, there's a lot of theory out there now that neither of those two things is necessary for democracy. But that what we have is a society that has at least three parts. There's the marketplace, there's the government, and there's civil society. And I'm going to explain the difference to you very, very easily. How many of you in the last 24 hours have paid any taxes? All right, let me ask a different question. How many of you, so that was almost everybody in the room. How many of you have bought anything? Anything? Paid for parking, maybe you don't have to do that here. Gum, coffee. Was that everybody in the room? I can extend it out, I'll make it 48 hours. Everybody bought something? Everybody paid any taxes? How many of you have made a charitable donation in the last 48 hours? Oh, fantastic. But look around. Keep those hands up, those of you. This has got to be the most nonprofit-centric crowd in 75 miles from here, or 7,500 miles from here, I don't know. And the number of people who were charitable was much less than the number of people who did the other two. Why? It's a choice. Thank you. It's a choice. You can't really escape the government or the marketplace. You could go live under a rock. That's about how far you'd have to go, right? But each and every day, even for those of us who work in the sector, our participation as volunteers, as donors, is by choice. That is a significant difference. And it comes back and back and back as we try to understand this relationship between digital technologies and civil society. It's also, again, I'm happy to share a reading list if you want to do a longer political science lecture on this, but there's also a sense then that civil society exists in democracy with some degree of independence from the other two sectors. It's not completely independent. This picture is misleading. They're not separate circles. They're very intertangled. But there's some degree of separation, and that separation at least comes from the fact that you can opt in and you can opt out, to use technological language, right? It's a voluntary space. And that independence, again, is something we want to think about. Alexander Hamilton, who was literally a revolutionary, talks about civil society, so now we're back in the late 1800s, as being the space in which we protect the rights of the minorities from the tyranny of the majority. Because the one thing that most everybody thinks they know about how democracies work is that this section over here is run by the majority. Doesn't happen to be true at the moment, and hasn't been true much in the last 20 years, and hasn't been true much in this country for a long time. But the idea of the government is that it's run by the majority of the people, and thus you've got to find a way to make space for and privilege and take care of and nurture the opinions, rights, values, cultures, beliefs of whoever might make up the minorities, which in some cases is 49% of the population, and in some really magic math worlds like ours, it's over 50% of the population. So this is a very important balance to think about. If you don't, do you know what the theory and history shows us what happens? If you don't have that space for the minorities? It's tyranny and or revolution. So it's a stabilizing force. Okay, so that's Poli-Sci 101. This is a picture that explains why when I do this, when I set up the lab at Stanford, I wanted to use the word civil society and not-for-profits. It comes, whoops, what am I pressing? I have like fast fingers today. I'm going to put that down. This comes from the UK, from a nationwide nonprofit-led investigation of civil society that's underway in the UK, where they tried to make sense of this space that they work in. And I put it up there. By the way, these slides are yours. You don't need to take notes or take pictures. They're all yours. I'll figure out, Peggy will tell me how that's going to happen, but you can have them. To get a sense of what's in this space. And I like the photo A because it's very colorful, and B because it's really dynamic. And if you're in any one of those bubbles, your daily work or your volunteer work or your, your members of your family, it should make you feel like, wow, this is a dynamic, changing space. Now, it would be worth it for the area of Pittsburgh to do the same kind of picture for a year. Figure out what's in that space, because we tend to think it's just nonprofits and funders, or just nonprofits and beneficiaries, or just nonprofits and governments. Well, it's not. It's much more complicated than that. But I want you to put this picture in your head, remembering that this is the United Kingdom, 2017, 2018, their vision of their world. Because what I hope I'm going to inspire you to think about over the course of this morning is, what do you want this picture to look like for where you are? Because you have a lot of influence over what that looks like. So this is civil society with all of its weird, strange, moving pieces. So if we got the political science frame of democracy, we've zoomed in a little bit on civil society. Let me tell you the definition I'm going to use. Peggy got awfully close to it for talking about digital civil society. It is all of the ways that we voluntarily use our private resources for public benefit in the digital age. All of them. Notice that there's no institution called out in there. It's not the not-for-profit sector. I'm not talking about certain kinds of institutions. I'm talking about the way this table and I, or that table and I, or you and you and you and I can get together and try to change something around us. Make something better, stop something from happening, build something that doesn't exist, help others that we care about. And what we're going to use when we do that are three things in the digital age. And these are the same three things that you are now responsible for managing in your day jobs as employees or as board members of not-for-profit institutions. Those three things are time, money, and digital data. Time, money, and digital data. That's why digital civil society is different. Because in civil society, before the digital age, you managed time and money. Now, let me see where this slide deck is going. Everybody take this out of your pocket. I know you have them. Anybody not have them? I usually don't carry mine with me, actually, but I've started that horrible thing of counting my steps. So I'm also going to do this all morning. Right? Take it out of your pocket, open it up, unlock it. Come on, what are you doing? Some of you are just sitting there. I'm talking to you. Take out your phone. You don't have one? Okay. So I'm talking to her. Take it out. Hold them up. I don't see them. There we go. Okay. Have you unlocked it? You've opened it up. You've unlocked it. Go ahead, hand it to somebody you don't know. I don't get it. What's so funny? What's so funny? Why is that funny? What's that? Check it for. Okay. So Malia's worried that when she hands it over, they're going to see that she was looking for that dog food on Amazon. Why are the rest of you laughing? Why is that funny? It's surprising. It's revealing to hand your phone over. It's private. Oh, it's private. Oh, okay, it's private. Oh, somebody's got a germ issue. I shouldn't say that. That sounds really judgmental. They're filthy. They're filthy. Probably the only thing filthier is the airline train table, right? So, a friend of mine actually said to me that he did get a waterproof case for his phone so that he could wash it every night, which, okay. Mine's just filthy. So, okay. So, done it around the world. Lots of people laugh. Lots of people get very uncomfortable. Some people won't do it. Did anybody refuse to do it? Why? Because it's filthy? Or?
Well, I have a compromised immune system, so I didn't want germs was my first thing.
Fantastic. Great. Important.
Plus two, it's my private property.
Okay, it's your private property. Very good. That's absolutely fine. Some people just won't do it. In fact, I showed you that map. I've also done this in countries that aren't up there. For some reason, and I call this out because I find it fascinating, the French will not do this. The Germans will, which you might, okay, but the French, nope, it's not, they won't even take it out of their purses. Anyway, there's a lot of information available to you on that device that I just asked you to unlock and hand to somebody. I wanted you to feel that discomfort. That was the point of that. I want you to get that into your body for just a second, that this thing that we all have, is there anybody in the room who doesn't have one? Okay, so everybody's got them. It makes you uncomfortable to hand it over to somebody. And for a lot of people, not everyone, but for a lot of people, the issue is privacy. Okay? Good. As long as you're feeling that, I don't want you to sit here uncomfortable for the rest of the morning, although sometimes I do that to people. You can feel free, if you haven't already, to give it back to the person who owns it. But can I get a volunteer? Anybody here who doesn't mind me touching their phone? I'm going to just go to the back of the room. Yeah, okay, yeah. Can you bring me your phone for a second? Tell me your name. My name's Ashley. Ashley. So here's a lesson in economics. Is it unlocked? No. Here you go. She doesn't trust me. Thanks. Thank you, Ashley. Who has Ashley's phone? I do. Who does not have Ashley's phone? Notice how Ashley's getting, she's like, where the heck is she going? So I have Ashley's phone and Ashley does not, right? Who else doesn't have Ashley's phone? The rest of you. That, my friends, is Econ 101. That is a rival and excludable good. I have it, and you don't, and nor do the rest of you, right? It's so familiar. You're like, what? She goes to Stanford? Like, we flew her in from California for this? Who has Ashley's data?
Many things.
So somebody's pointing, sir, you're pointing at the ceiling. The ceiling tie? What do you mean by the ceiling? The ether? Well, be a little more specific than that. Okay, so the network proprietor. So Hilton Incorporated. Who else? Google. It's an Android. It's a Samsung. Somebody asked who made it. It just locked itself, so I can't tell you much more about it. All the networks, all those apps that are on it. The network. Who else? Keep going. The telecom provider, so if it's AT&T or Verizon or Sprint, luckily there's only 3 of those. I don't have to keep going, luckily. Yep, it's Samsung, so we got those. Who else? Everyone she gave permission to. Who else? Pardon me? Anybody who paid for the data. Who else? You're missing a couple of really obvious participants in this mix. Her contacts, her friends. Who else has Ashley's data? I do. Thank you. And, yep, we've mentioned the government, our government, other governments. This goes over really well when I do this in other countries. But you're missing, okay, you got me, but who else? Ashley. Okay, right there, stop right there. When we talked about the phone itself, I had it, Ashley didn't, and nobody else did. It's a basic, rival, and excludable good. When we talk about the data, though, first of all, you listed about 35 things who aren't even represented by people in the room. And finally, you got to the fact that both Ashley and I simultaneously have access to the resource. That is a fundamentally different economic resource than the first one. The first one, only one person can have at a time. The second one, both of us have it simultaneously, plus all these other things that, like, as you pointed to the ceiling, we can't even see them. Folks, do not underestimate how significant that difference is. That difference between rival and economic goods and what are called non-rival, rival and excludable goods, and non-rival and non-excludable, which is debatable goods, that is why we have governments and markets. Our entire social structure for thousands of years has been built around economic resources that say, I have it and you don't. In fact, any philanthropists in the room? Philanthropy doesn't exist if you don't have that basic dynamic. I have it and you don't. We are dealing with something that's so profoundly different at the most basic level of itself. All of you have phones in your pocket, and yet none of you had stopped to think about that. That is a remarkable transition. It is a fundamentally different thing. And we all depend on it. Yet we haven't stopped to think about it, which is precisely why things feel so weird right now. Right? It is not about a social media account. It is about the fact that you were standing on land a minute ago, or about 20 years ago, and now you're trying to stand on water. That's why it feels so weird. There's your economics lesson. You knew it, you just didn't have the words for it. Let's thank Ashley for trusting me with her phone. Now, I got a lot of slides and a lot of information, and it's all on that website, digitalimpact.io, and I'm not going to go through it with you, but that goes into that in more detail. But if you ever want to have, that's a great party trick. You can do that at a cocktail party. Give me your phone, right? And that's how deeply different what we're dealing with is. The other metaphor, and this also works at cocktail parties, and you can do it with fun beverages, is to help you and anybody at your cocktail parties or your coffee clutches or whatever it is you want to, where you might, back at your office, most importantly. Think about back to that non-rival nature of digital data, in which many entities have it at once, and your use of it doesn't affect my use of it, right? Think about water. We all know that H2O is the chemical construction of water, right? And you also know that if you freeze it, it becomes an ice cube. And if you heat it, it becomes steam. But what's the chemical, or if you leave it at room temperature, it's liquid. What's the chemical composition of ice, liquid, and the gas? It's H2O. You haven't changed the thing, you've changed the format of the thing, right? This is what happens when you digitize data. And when I say data, I mean a photograph of Cindy, a spreadsheet, your email address, your social security number that's buried deep in that encrypted part of the database that's not on the internet, hopefully, maybe. And the version of it that is, right? So anything that's digitized, I'm not going to use the BIG word, because I don't care how much of it you have. If you digitize it, it changes into this form. It changes from ice cube or liquid to like steam. The other reason things feel so weird right now, not even at the big state of US democracy or global democracy, probably just at the state of your organization, is that your not-for-profit organization, now I'm making a big assumption here, how many of you actually work for not-for-profit organizations? Corporations, so 501c3, not-for-profit, okay, perfect, right? That is a invented thing, by the way. And for our history lesson, I could tell you where it came from, but I won't. But the not-for-profit corporation is a thing. It's chartered in law, it has certain rules, you know about this, you have boards of directors, blah, 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 you file certain papers, you do certain things, right? We created that form. Think of that enterprise form, that institutional corporate form like this glass, okay? Why do I use a glass? Because back when we created it, actually not far from here, it managed time and money. And time and money, in my metaphor, are rival and excludable things. They're like water, the glass works perfectly, right? We create an institution to transform the resources into public good. The resources work like time and money, because that's what they were. They're liquid, works just fine. Welcome to 2018, where we're going to metaphorically turn up the heat a little bit. And some of this liquid is going to turn into gas. And how good is the glass at managing the steam? Not so good. Exactly. Is this metaphor helpful? Because I'll stop killing it if it's just confusing you, right? You are managing 3 resources now. And you have no choice in this, by the way. Does everybody at your organization have an email address? You are a digital nonprofit, congratulations. That's all it takes. You have a networked printer? Whoop, done. You must now manage toward your mission time, money, that's great, you got a glass, it's full of water, oops, and digitized data. Now what do you do? Okay? That's why things feel so strange. So take somebody's phone, hand them a glass of water, you've just had an actually quite sophisticated lesson in not just fluid dynamics, but economics and political science. Now, the other thing we know about steam is that it can be an incredibly powerful source of energy. So we don't want to just lose it, right? We know that there's great power to that digitized data. We know from research and things that are happening where people are building extraordinary databases of different kinds of information, and we're finding new cures for all kinds of diseases, and we're improving research, and we're finding out things about poverty patterns, and we can do all kinds of things with this information when we use it well. I like to think of this actually as the new social calculus. That in fact, it's possible, if you manage your digital data well, safely, ethically, and effectively, you can in fact get 2 outcomes for 1 action. Now that's some good math, right? Especially for resource-constrained nonprofits. Any of those in the room? Okay, good. So if you can get 2 outcomes for 1 action, great, let's do it. But it's not addition, it's calculus. So here's the example I'll give you. Oh God, I'm already out of time. I'm 1 slide into my thing. Here's the example. Crisis text line uses texting instead of phone calls to provide counseling services. What happens when you digitize your service is that you actually alloy together your data collection process and your service. Right? So when you text message, the data about those counseling sessions is automatically in a format that you can make a really powerful database for public policy makers or researchers. However, you're also, if you're providing counseling services to teenagers, you know that that data is incredibly sensitive. Why is it calculus, not math? Because you can't just keep all of that automatically encoded digital data and put it into a database. You're going to be making those young people more vulnerable than they were at the beginning, because you can't protect that information. And you probably haven't even asked them for it, right? So you have to do a number of things between collecting the data, or even thinking about collecting the data, and storing it in order to get this calculus. I am now going to go into like warp speed. But that's what we're aspiring to, but we have to remember that we have to manage this resource. The digital transformation we've talked about a little bit, that's the fact that it's that we are dependent on this resource that's like gas and not liquid. The other thing is all the folks who pointed to the ceiling when I asked who's got access to the data. Suddenly, all of your communications are intermediated by a bunch of tech companies, and a bunch of telecom companies, and Hilton. You know, like, where'd they come from? So civil society, if you go back to that picture in the beginning where there's some distance, where there's some independence between what you do and the markets and the governments in the digital age, they're not just your vendors. They're not just your software choice. Here's a better way to think about them. They're your landlords. And how many of you have read your lease? That's what I thought. Okay. Great, good. Who said that? Right on. We all need to read those leases. And in fact, we all need to stand up and collectively write some different ones. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I'm going to need an extra 5 minutes. Okay. All right. I'm going to need an extra 10 minutes. Right. I'm standing between them and coffee. I know. Okay. All right. But yes, absolutely right. That's where we're going with this. So we've covered on a couple of things. But we know now, you know viscerally, how different this resource is. Digital also, and you'll hear more and more about this if you're reading the news now, you got to go through a few pages of other stuff, but we are using data and algorithms to make decisions about how people get jobs. Anybody heard any of those ads for ZipRecruiter? That's algorithmic job sorting. They don't call it that, but they give you actually a lovely little introduction to it in their ad when they talk about how it searches for keywords. It also makes decisions about who gets welfare benefits, about who goes to prison, who gets to pay bail. We live in a democracy. I took the position as an election commissioner because it's my job as a citizen, as a resident of this country, to scrutinize the way decisions get made by my government. That's actually how a democracy works. But the more, in fact, we use algorithms to make these decisions, the harder it gets to scrutinize how they're being made. That's problematic. We need to change that, we need to address it, and we in the civil society need to think about how we're going to do that. Are we going to collect a bunch of data on people without asking them for it, and then run a set of algorithms against it that we can't explain to them how we made those decisions? We also know that it generates digital. Every time you click on your database, you've created more data for another database. We're in this loop. We're in this process now. We just keep creating more and more of it. And as you start to, when you're collecting it then from people, you have to think about this. It's not a one-off transaction. You're now in a life cycle of a relationship with people. There's all kinds of questions about ownership. Again, this is why things feel so weird. Because back in the day when the philanthropist owned the dollar and she gave it to you, now you had the dollar, it was pretty clear this idea of ownership and use, right? But in an age when everybody or lots of players can have access to one thing at any one time, the whole notion of ownership gets a little confusing. And if we don't know who owns something, we, particularly here in the US, have to really reimagine how things work. Because so much of our social fabric and our history has been defined by this idea of who owns something. Even things that should never have been ownable. The history of this country, right? But we need to figure out how to rethink ownership. We also don't know where things are coming from, okay? So this is, again, this is sort of all in the why things feel so weird. One of the things that's really important, one of this idea that it, all of the way you manage your database is linked to democracy, is because if we're all connected, and we're all connected by these digital networks that are globally interconnected, and we're sharing or not sharing, or trying to protect or not protecting what we have on that network, the language that cybersecurity people use is the attack surface. And what we've seen is that the attack surface of our democracy has shifted dramatically. That you can interfere with anybody's government, not just the one in the US, from afar. You can interfere with the government of your organization from afar because the attack surface has been so expanded. If you like great political thrillers, watch this, Secret City. And it shows you this in some graphic forms I can't do in a static slide. So how is digital civil society different then? All right? We've talked about what it looked like. We've talked about the nature of digital change. We've talked about the fact that it's not just nonprofits. But how is digital civil society changing all around us even as we sit here? A couple of ways I want to show. We have vastly new and different ways of volunteering. Anybody here involved in the open mapping community? Okay, hand in the back, couple hands, great. So this is a way to participate as a volunteer by helping create and update and maintain maps that can be used by anybody anywhere. They're often used in disaster response. So you got people volunteering their time in one part of the world. Maybe they're sitting in their apartment, they're doing what they do, they're collecting information, they're making sense of it, and you've got people on the ground in a disaster using that information. They could be anywhere in the world. That is a vastly different notion of volunteering and impact and civil society than we're used to understanding. We also, just as the community foundation was invented 100 years ago, the philanthropic foundation was invented about 100 and some odd years ago, the not-for-profit organization was invented about 150 years ago. We made these things up and we're making up new ones. So check this out. The Open Collective is essentially aspiring to be the digital, the not-for-profit corporate form, the glass, if you will, in an age when we manage time, money, and steam. And it launched earlier this year. And there's a few thousand of them already. This is fascinating. This is people actually innovating on the form. That's number one. We're also changing the way we behave. Anybody downloaded the new iOS or your new Android software? They built into it this thing that tells you, boy, you have wasted a ton of time on Snapchat today, right? Now that is not in Apple's interest, it's not in Snap's interest, and it's not in Android's interest. Why'd they do it? Because people like us said to the companies, enough with this stuff. We're addicted to it. And you're responsible, now let's fix it. There's a couple things I want you to think about this. You can, I don't care what you do with your phone, that's up to you. But how you use your phone and how you think about technology from your own personal perspective, this is why I wanted to make you uncomfortable at the start of this. You have taken those behaviors and carried them into the workplace and said, this is how we're going to do it. Because most of us don't know how this stuff really works. That is okay, except I want you to stop it. It's inappropriate. What do you do with your dog photos? That's your business. What do you do with the data on the people your organization serves? Not okay. So how we behave around our tech is important. Again, another example of how it's changing our social norms. That's the 50-cent word for how we behave. We now, if you remember the Panama Papers from a couple of years ago, it was a global effort. It involved 109 different, many of them not-for-profit organizations working simultaneously in 76 countries. Wow, that's a different way to work. That takes it beyond Pittsburgh. But that's how we do things nowadays. So are you ready to work that way? Oh, God, yeah. That button, not that button. The policy boundaries change. How many of you know what these initials stand for, besides the fact that it says on the bottom? Who made this slide? How many? Only a few of you? Okay, remember I said your tech company was your landlord? So is the EU now. They've passed some new laws about how data need to be protected. For the most part, even if you don't have EU residents or citizens in your bailiwick. Do you have a website? Anybody have a website? Do you absolutely positively know for sure that nobody from the EU is ever looking at it? No, you don't. Abide by the EU GDPR. Another good reason? The values underlying it are the same values that underlie civil society. We can talk about that. Here's another idea of how the laws are changing and what we think of as the legal space. Digital Geneva Convention. We have the Geneva Convention after World War II. It was built and signed and motivated by and agreed to by nation states, countries. This one, first idea, proposed, Chief Legal Counsel of Microsoft. Wait, the nation of Microsoft? Who makes the laws now? Who proposes them? Well, if companies can, and they are, and this is also involving civil society, then civil society can as well. We need to step into this game. There are new technological possibilities. It's not Bitcoin that matters, it's the blockchain. And does it matter? I don't know. But it's a way to get back to the idea of a decentralized and encrypted web, which was part of the original design. So we're reinventing, we're going backwards to go forwards, we're examining the original values of the web. We're also re-engaging with technologies, many of which that have existed since about 25 years ago, that say, you know what, maybe you ought to control your own identity. Not me, Amazon, not me, Stanford, not me, Hilton, not me, Apple, not me, Samsung, but you, and you, and you, and Ashley. Ashley will control her. She's the only person whose name I know. So technology for what's called a terrible term, self-sovereign identity, which was, the technology actually has been created 25 years ago. Business model, the internet said, yeah, we don't need that. We don't actually want people to control their data. No, we don't want that. It's back, and something to engage with. Here are the four ways so the four types of transformation I just tried to explain to you very quickly and poorly fall into these four buckets. This is where my lab does all of its work. We look at the changes in each of those things. I encourage you, when you're thinking about how your organization uses digitized data, to think about all four of those domains. It's not something you can hire a vendor and they'll solve it for you. You have to think about your whole organization. And as we do that, we are reinventing civil society. We are creating these new types of organizations, and you're responsible for doing that in this part of the world. I apologize for rambling on so long. This is how you can get in touch with me. The digitalimpact.io website that I mentioned provides a set of free, downloadable tools, policies, checklists, sample template from other organizations that you can use at your organization to help address some of these questions in a very practical way. How to talk to your board, how to write the right IP policy, how to think about working with vendors. It's the real nuts and bolts of this, and I invite you to be in contact with me, be happy to set up a conversation with the TechNow community. I'm going to stop talking. If you'll let me take a question or two, or not, I'll just stand over there and you can talk to me.
So if you all are ready to give 5 minutes up of your coffee break and change, we'll let Lucy take a question now. She's also around today, so she can interact with you all at the breaks and at her time and just make, I really want you to have a chance to talk to her about anything you want. But how about let's get at least one question. There must be a burning question in there.
Listen, how to be a terrible guest is to throw your host's agenda off for the entire day. Cindy?
Do you have an example of an organization who has taken the things that are in digitalimpact.io and how's it going?
So one thing about all of the materials on Digital Impact is that they've actually come from you. So we created some of them, but only after we've talked to nonprofits. But the best example, and I believe the case study is up there, the best example I know of, and I only have one, and boy, I'd love to have 1 million of these, of an organization that looked at digitized data and said, wow, we have to change our entire organization soup to nuts, is Oxfam UK, which has put in place a data collection process that aligns with human rights principles, given the kind of work that Oxfam does, and has moved what looks on paper like, oh, it's a data policy, and completely transformed the way everyone in that organization thinks about digitized data. They spent 3 years developing the policies, practicing it with people, talking to the people, everyone who was going to be touched by this, and then moving that through this very complicated, federated global organization. 3 years. You know how long the policy, when it expires? First of all, it has an expiration date on it. Do you know when it comes? 2 years from now. Why? You think technology is going to be the same 2 years from now as it is now? No. And they know that. We know that. So that's the best example I have. Yes?
Under a workforce development organization, what are the career skills that best suit someone to participate in the workshop?
They need to understand the economics of digital data, and you can do that with a cell phone, right? Then you need to be able, in whatever organization it is they're going to work for, they need to be able to think about how are we managing this resource in line with the mission of that organization? Now, if all of you had the same mission, I could give you an answer to the question. But you don't. So in terms of skills, it's really, I mean, because this isn't just for the database manager. This is for the CEO and the board of trustees. You want to get your board's attention, by the way? Ask them about their insurance policy for directors. Because if there's a data breach, they're liable. Just as if you walked out of there with a cash in your hand, right? So it's a great question, but it's something all of us need to understand. Whether or not you're in this, we need, as people, to understand the way these things work so that we can think about how to use them at our organizations appropriately. And there's a reason, this is my last comment, there's a reason you don't know how these things work. Right? It's not because you don't care or you don't think about it. It's because for over a decade now, several big companies have been trying to sell billions of these things. And they've been incredibly successful, right? You don't sell billions of these things if anybody has to know how they work. Right? I'm holding a phone in my hand. If you had to know how it worked, you wouldn't have 3 of the old ones in your drawer at home. So there's a reason, but that's the core thing that I care about is understanding our collective need to manage digital data and govern it for public purpose. That's what you need to know. Thank you.